Hi there, and welcome to the Stronger Than Reason show. So, let me tell you what the idea is here. I'm a guy who's 40, 50-ish, a Gen Xer, grew up in the Northeast of the United States. And back in the day, there used to be this idea of music stores where you would go and purchase music to actually own. And I, during that period, acquired a vast collection of CDs. Now, why was I collecting CDs and not something cool like vinyl? That's a story maybe for another time. But the fact is that I wound up with several hundred of these CDs, a lot of which were around the genre of electronic and industrial music. So around that time, the late 80s, early 90s, and that's kind of the music that I love. So what I noticed the other day is that I had a huge pile of these CDs in the basement and kind of started looking at them, and I've sort of fallen out of looking at actual physical music media, and it was interesting for me to pull these things off the shelf and look at the liner notes and the covers and think about things like where I purchased these and what I was doing in my life at the time. And I noticed a lot of CDs in there that I really love and mean a lot to me, and I thought it would be interesting to revisit this collection and talk about maybe some of these CDs that are meaningful to me and just throw it online for the hell of it, because why not? Maybe we'll get some conversations going about this music. So Stronger Than Reason, obviously, if you're of a certain age and of a certain mindset, you're going to recognize that phrase as coming from the song Stigmata by Ministry. And, that's a kind of a song that falls right in the middle of my area of interest there. And so I decided to start by talking about Ministry. Maybe not my favorite band in the world, but in particular, their album Twitch was very important for my musical development, and maybe that's true. I suspect that's true for a lot of people. So picture this, 1987, I'm in high school, like junior high. At this point in my life, I'm listening mostly to MTV, FM radio. Wasn't a huge fan of a lot of different bands at this time, but I was a fan of Rush, and I think a lot of people, Rush is kind of a culty kind of band. They sort of appeal to nerds, and I don't know. And you can go out and read about Rush if you're not familiar with them. There's an excellent documentary called Beyond the Lighted Stage that is really does a good job at explaining Rush fandom, but I was definitely, square in that Rush camp. But around 1987, we also had Pink Floyd release A Momentary Lapse of Reason, and at the time I didn't know from Pink Floyd. I wasn't listening to any of their older material, had no clue about it. Momentary Lapse came out though, and for some reason I and all of my friends sort of latched on to that album and really just listened to the hell out of it. So that's kind of where my head was musically around this time. Also, I didn't have much of a music collection as a teenager. The music that I did own was mostly on cassettes. Now, cassettes I understand, are coming back, around. They're in favor these days among the folks who know what's cool and hip. And at the time, cassettes were not cool and hip. They had terrible sound reproduction, but their great advantage was that, unlike vinyl, you could put a cassette in a Walkman and you could walk around with it. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what a Walkman is, it's kind of an, early iPod. And if you're not familiar with what an iPod is, why are you even listening to this show? I have no idea. But yeah, so most of my music was on cassettes at the time, and these were cassettes that, often, let's be frank, we copied from our friends, right? So you would have a cheap stereo, and it would have a dual cassette deck, and you'd put your friend's cassette in one side, and you'd record onto a blank cassette on the other side. That's, early Napster folks. That's how we shared music back in the late 80s and early 90s. Or you would maybe tape songs off of the radio. That was something else that these all-in-one stereos could do. And I have fond memories of sitting there when the countdown show was on with my finger poised over the record button and my tape queued up because I was making a mixtape. So, like it or not, that's how we shared music back in the day. I lived in the middle of nowhere, more or less, in Northeast United States, and we had a quote-unquote big city that was about 60 miles away. So on good nights, you would be able to hear their modern rock radio station. And maybe a couple times a year you'd drive over to the big mall over in the big city where you could buy interesting music, because the music store in my town had just about nothing other than, Rush, which I was certainly into. So that's kind of the culture at the time. Obviously there was an internet, but we weren't a part of it. The internet was not going to be part of the popular world for at least another 5 or 6 years. There was no such thing as like an ISP. I didn't even have I guess I did have a computer in the house, but it was an Apple II, and it wasn't connected to anything. It was not networked at all. So, yeah, your mechanisms for getting information about music were pretty slim. And your musical culture was mostly word of mouth between you and your friends. But two things were about to change my musical world and kind of break me out of that mold. The first was a friend of mine who's still a friend, and he still does this. He pulled me aside one day and said, "You've got to hear this tape." And he had this tape that he copied, probably off of some of his skater friends. And all we knew about this tape was the band name, and the band name was Ministry. So we didn't know the name of the album, we didn't know song names, but it was probably a third or fourth generation copy of this album, so the sound wasn't even very good. But I guess I made a copy of this and started listening to it. And the first track came on and just blew my mind, and I didn't know what I was hearing. It had huge drums, this ridiculous, massive drum sound. The drums are really prominent, and I was a drummer in middle school. I didn't have a drum set. I played with the band, but I was the guy that growing up was always tapping on things. And if you talk to my family, they'll tell you that I used to drive everybody crazy just tapping on stuff constantly, particularly my sister. Sorry about that, sis. But yeah, the rhythm on these tracks was amazing and just grabbed my mind immediately. But then there was this thick, funky bass on this track, and it had all these movie samples and effects sprinkled into it. And then this voice came on. It was kind of distorted. It was vaguely British. I couldn't really hear it very well. I could make out the words, and the words, were just, I didn't know what to make of the words. They were sort of like cynical. I don't know, I didn't know the word at the time, but maybe kind of dystopian, and there were these like funny movie samples sprinkled in there that sounded like they were from 50s or 60s movies, and the whole thing was just very strange and grabbed my imagination. Toward the end of this song, though, there was this synth solo that would have fit awesomely on an ELP record. Like it was kind of incongruous. And all I was thinking was, damn, this guy can play some keyboard. Like, that was a groovy-ass solo. And it showed that there was, obviously there was talent from arranging the song, but there was also some musicianship. Somebody could play some keyboard. And little did I know that it was probably all programmed with MIDI at the time. I didn't know what the hell MIDI was. But yeah, it sounded really cool. And the album went from there. The next track was this darker, downbeat thing with all these arpeggiated synths and just this like 4-on-the-floor kick drum. The drums were still very prominent, and track after track like fell into this kind of pattern. They were clearly pop songs, but they used electronics in these ways I'd never heard before, and it was really, really interesting. There were pop sensibilities, there were tons of hooks, but it had this sort of aggressive electronic edge to it. And the last half of the second side of this album sort of devolved into 15 minutes of just total chaos. It was fast beats, these samples from Platoon, there were metal bashing sounds, and it was just intense and nuts, and I had never heard anything like it. And it kind of blew my mind. I guess the closest thing in my world at the time that I could compare it to, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but it would be the theme song to Miami Vice, which was maybe the most prominent bit of electronic music that was in the culture at the time. But this album was darker. It had like it was a lot more like minor key stuff, a lot more like harsher noises. It was if Jan Hammer had been forced to make music from like sounds recorded, I don't know, in the front lines of World War II. I didn't know what to make of it. I just knew I loved it. So that led to the question, who is this band Ministry? Who are these guys? Or who are they? And the name to me suggested something maybe religious, or maybe ironically religious, or maybe it was a reference to Orwell's 1984, which I was, reading around that time. But it's important to remember we had very few ways to answer that sort of question back in 1987, right? The internet was still a few years away. MTV was on in every household, but it wasn't playing this kind of music yet. Most of the information that we got about bands was through word of mouth, and the word of mouth said that Ministry was a bunch of Satanists. Maybe inevitably, right? This is during the great satanic panic of the 1980s. But naturally, as kids, that just intrigued us all the more. Applying a little bit of critical thinking to this, I listened to the record. You could make out a lot of the lyrics, and they certainly didn't sound satanic to me. In fact, one song mentioned an angel, so it had that going for it. Another song mentioned the word possession, but to me it sounded, the song lyrics in context sounded nonsensical, just a bunch of word salad. It certainly wasn't talking about demonic possession. And the other lyrics were actually political in a sort of ham-fisted way. It was definitely nothing that sounded obviously satanic or trying to be satanic, like Slayer, for instance. So, I doubted the whole satanic thing. But what did I know? I didn't know who these people were at all. So I searched the local record stores for Ministry, trying to figure out what the heck they were. And eventually I stumbled across this album. And it turned out the album was called Twitch. So the second thing that was going to rock my world at this time was, strangely, my sister's boyfriend. So she was going out with this guy who was a music nut, and I don't know if he was a DJ or what, but he had a great love of music. I don't know that he loved my sister, but he had a great love of music, and he was happy to share that collection with me. So he ended up making me, a lot of cassettes of alternative music. So he was teaching me the lore behind the music. So he was explaining to me, for instance, that there was Bauhaus, and they became, one guy left and they became Tones on Tail, and then they became Love and Rockets when another guy joined, and that sort of thing. And then, Johnny Rotten was in the Sex Pistols, and he left the Sex Pistols and made PIL. And that's where I got my first understanding of popular music at the time, the stuff that wasn't on the radio. Depeche Mode was this guy's favorite band, and I think Enjoy the Silence was popular around this time, or maybe that was a little later. This might have been a little later. But regardless, it would take me a little bit of time to really dig into Depeche Mode. They would eventually become one of my favorite bands. But back when I had found the cassette of Twitch, I remember showing it to him, kind of proud of myself. And he said, "Whoa, you're getting into industrial music." And I said, "Like, what music?" And he said, "Industrial." And I was like, "What is that?" But it blew my mind, because I realized this wasn't just an album, but it was a whole genre. There was a whole genre of music to discover, industrial music. So, it was exciting. It was like finding a clue in a mystery. Now I had another word to use to help me search for more of this thing that I liked, and I didn't know what industrial music meant, but at least I had something to go on. So, the first thing I did when I got my cassette of Twitch, which I still have like buried in deep storage in the archives, but I eventually did pick up a CD of it. That's the thing, they got all of us. The music industry got all of us in the day because we ended up buying the same albums over and over in different formats, and it's still going on today. And, everybody likes streaming now. They like paying Spotify, $10 a month or whatever it is. That's not for me. Like, I definitely prefer owning music in some form or fashion. And, I thought about going to vinyl. That's, again, a discussion we'll have another time. But I kind of don't really want to have to buy my entire collection all over again. It's just not worth it to me. But anyway, when I got the cassette of Twitch, what I immediately did was just sort of pulled it apart and looked at every aspect of it to try to get as much information about ministry as I could. So, let's look here. We have this cover art, which later I realized shows Al Jorgensen. He's covered in Lord knows what, looks like some sort of powder or cornstarch, or I think I read later that these photos were taken for a video shoot, so they might have been processed in some way. Not entirely sure. Some cool photography there, some fine print. The song titles here. The first track was Just Like You. All the other tracks listed here. The CD actually contains a couple bonus tracks that weren't on my cassette. So that was interesting. And something that bummed me out too, as a cassette collector back in the day, I didn't own a CD player until I was probably about 19. And I missed out, it seemed, on a lot of music because I didn't have the ability to play CDs. So that was a game changer for me when I got a CD player. Suddenly I got all these bonus tracks. But yeah, the title Twitch, I'm pretty sure was was mentioned in the first track, Just Like You, so that's where that came from. But I later read in Al Jorgensen's autobiography that it was really a reference to speed, because he wrote this album while mostly on speed, or whiz as he called it. And one thing that became clear over the years that's still true today is that Al is a guy who takes a lot of drugs, does a lot of, drinks a lot of alcohol, and just basically has every vice known to man. And reading his autobiography, you quickly get the idea that that's what is important to him. So his autobiography is almost really a catalog of all the different substances that he's taken over the years and which albums he made under which substances, and didn't really dwell much on, the inspiration for the music or the mechanics of actually writing and recording the music, but it's more like, I was so wasted on this or that, which, whatever, musicians are going to be that way to some extent, at least some of them. So, yeah, the liner notes said that this was, let's see here, they have all sorts of information in here that I was able to pick up. There's a line in here that says, ministry is Alain Jorgensen. And I thought, Alain, like, what kind of name is that, But I thought it was interesting that the band was just one person, that there was one person behind this whole thing. But of course, they list some other people here. Some of these tracks were produced by Adrian Sherwood, engineered by Gareth Jones. These would become familiar names over the years. Keith LeBlanc played some drums on here. Patty J did some vocals. I'm pretty sure my cassette actually listed her last name as Jorgensen. Of course, she was Al's wife at the time. It's interesting here that Brad Holland played bass on All Day, and Stephen George played percussion on that song. I think they were basically Al's live band in the earlier phase of ministry. In fact, if you have With Sympathy, I think there's a picture of Steve and George with Al on the inside of that record. Luke Van Acker on vocals of Where You At Now. So Luke would come into play later on, of course, with the Revolting Cocks. And the Cocks get a shout out here, thanks to the Revolting Cocks gang in Brussels. And that confused me a little bit at the time, like the who what gang? Little did I know. So again, like just digesting every word of these liner notes to try to figure out more about this band that was making such interesting music at the time. So yeah, little did I know about the Revolting Cocks, but right around this time, Al was putting together this album, Big Sexy Land, which is the debut LP for the Revolting Cocks. And the Cocks would be Al and Luke Van Acker and Richard 23 of Front 242. And in my mind, these two albums kind of go together. Al had this thing with the Cocks and Ministry where there was sort of a, parallel work going on at all times. And at least in my mind, these two albums are from the same era. They have sort of a similar sound going on. So I would argue that Twitch is to Big Sexy Land as the subsequent Ministry albums, Land of Rape and Honey and The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, are to the Beer Steers and Queers record from Revolting Cocks, which those three albums have a very similar sound going on and were recorded around the same time. So yeah, great album, Big Sexy Land. We'll probably talk about that in another episode. So going down through the track list here, we have Just Like You, like I said, just big bombastic drums, sort of an up-tempo thing. And just, lyrics that I guess are, I don't know what the heck Al's talking about there, about society, how beat down the average people are in the world. We believe, very critical of governments, the people in power. Like this guy had something to say. It might have not been anything incredibly sophisticated, but at least it was clear, to teenage me listening to this, that this guy had something to say about the world. He wasn't just singing about love, obviously. All Day was, just a very obvious like pop track, and a really well done pop track. Had really great vocals on it. And The Angel was sort of this down-tempo thing, and I think that's the one that Patty sings on. And I can hear it in my head as I'm saying this. Good stuff. Over the Shoulder is a funny track because I love the instrumental part of it, the arrangement, the sounds. In my mind, it's the most quintessentially industrial track on here because the rhythms are all pulled from like factory noises. It's very stereotypically industrial. What breaks that song, unfortunately, is, Al affecting this British accent, which people have talked about over and over the years, over the shoulder, over the years. But that was selected as the single from this album. And for better or worse, it's got Al doing this very campy, like, Euro British accent on there, and it sounds kind of ridiculous. And for me, it makes the whole song really hard to listen to. I wish he had just toned it down a little bit, or maybe even a year or two later just re-recorded the song with his normal vocals, because it would have been a killer. My Possession is kind of this fast-paced, it's a faster, more techno-y kind of song. Pretty cool. And then Where You At Now, Crash and Burn, and Twitch version 2, they all kind of blend together for me. But that's that sort of, melange of fast beats and weird sound effects, and it just kind of goes crazy at the end. There's samples in there from Platoon. I think Luke Van Acker's in there shouting and hollering. There's a lot of sound effects going on, and I couldn't tell you where one started and the other began because they're all lumped into track 7 on the CD, so who knows. There's a 12-inch version of Over the Shoulder here that's extended, and then this weird track called Isle of Man, which is really down tempo. In fact, I'm not sure that it has beats at all, and it says version 2, but I've never seen or heard of a version 1 there. But altogether, like, really interesting music and a pretty good variety there. I have to say, like, I was fortunate to stumble on this when I did, fortunate to learn about Ministry when I did. They were just on the verge of getting more popular in the United States. And, you know, around that time, the late 80s, Al would really become like the sun around which the rest of industrial bands orbited, right? So he became the center of this network, and really the guy who was leading this genre of music. And he would put his finger into a lot of different projects over the years, across different bands and different labels, as we'll see as we continue talking about these albums. Yeah, I'll talk about some of those projects later, but think about projects like the Revolting Cocks, which was sort of like the bizarro version of Ministry for the most part, with a lot of the same people involved. But then he had PTP, he had 1,000 Homo DJs, he did Lard with Jello Biafra, he did Lead into Gold with Paul Barker. There's just a lot of different bands. Acid Horse he did with Cabaret Voltaire. All of these side projects were just a result of this great amount of collaboration that was going on in the scene at the time. And I'll certainly talk about all of those projects later. But for me, it all started, you know, with Twitch. And I guess going way back, industrial music started with a band called Throbbing Gristle. You know, they coined the term, so it really did start with them. And there was always predecessors, right? For any kind of music you want to talk about, there's always a predecessor. And there were predecessors that Throbbing Gristle had as well. So whether it was Edgar Varese or, you know, the music concrete that occurred in the earlier part of the 20th century, like, it goes all the way back to John Cage, you know, people who are making transgressive music. But Throbbing Gristle coined the term industrial music on their first album. I think they had a blurb on there that said industrial music for industrial people. And so that people took that as input and started turning that into something else. So Al, his role was to expand the definition of industrial music, and what he did was he moved it away from experimental noise and more into the realm of pop music, and that's certainly, you know, what was going on here. And eventually this would become industrial rock, and Ministry would be proponents of that in their next few albums. I would argue Twitch probably isn't rock at all. I think that's easy to state. The first half, at least, of this record, or most of the tracks in the beginning, are definitely pop. There's like verse, chorus, verse structures. There's a million hooks. It's really catchy. Little did I know at the time that this was Ministry's second album. And of course we all went out and bought that first album and were a little dismayed that it was straight up new wave music. So it was almost like stereotypical 80s new wave, like Howard Jones or something, you know. But still, it was pretty well done. But really, Twitch was not Ministry evolving from old school Throbbing Gristle industrial into pop. It was, you know, Al bridging this former sound into a new one. So he was making something new. It's something that was more aggressive, it was more rhythmic, it had pop sensibilities. You know, the drums were the most important thing in this music. The drums drove the rhythm and the energy. And in my opinion, you know, this style would reach a peak on the next album after this, which we'll talk about. I mentioned it before, but we'll talk about it in another episode here. Another really important album. And in my mind, the way I thought about this sort of music was that, you know, if you turned on the radio, the FM radio at the time, all of the music was really driven by vocals and guitar. and the drums were an afterthought. The drums and the bass were really an afterthought. But in this sort of music, the drums were emphasized. You know, they were brought up in the mix, they were distorted. The rhythm was the thing, and everything else kind of sat on top of that, like the icing on the cake. So it was just a different way of looking at music, and it really opened up my world. So how does this record sound now? I think it still holds up pretty well. Is it flawless? It's certainly not flawless. Like I said, I wish Al had redone the vocals for Over the Shoulder to drop the stupid accent. I can barely listen to it. It's like fingernails on a blackboard to me. And I realize a lot of industrial sounds like fingers on a blackboard, but this is, you know, in a bad way. I can't listen to it. Also, some of these sounds are pretty dated and sound very 80s. But also, in a way, that's clear in retrospect. And if it sounds formulaic, to some extent, it sounds formulaic because Al defined that formula, right? So plenty of bands copied Al's approach after this record, and especially over the next 5 or 6 years after this record came out. Ministry was already on Sire at this point, you know, but Al used the money that he made from this record to fund Wax Trax Records. So Wax Trax was a record store. They started as a record store. I think it started in Denver, and then they moved to Chicago. And the guys who ran Wax Trax, Jim Nash and Danny Flesher, decided to start a record label. And they had Al living in Chicago at the time, and they formed a partnership. Even though Al ended up, you know, moving on to Sire, he was funneling money back to Wax Trax. And together, they would really be responsible for growing that Chicago industrial scene. And to be clear, you know, clearly a lot of the Wax Trax bands were inspired by Al. They were inspired by him, or kind of aping what he did. And of course, Al and Paul Barker were a production team. They weren't just performers. So they went by the aliases of Hypoluxa and Hermes Pan. And you'd always see that produced by Luxa Pan credit on many of the industrial records, and certainly a lot of the records that were coming out on Wax Trax at the time. So, you know, so at this point in my life, my musical world opened up. Industrial would be a big part of that. I started listening clearly to bands like Nine Inch Nails, Skinny Puppy, Knights of Reb, Front 2 for 2, all the Ministry side projects, we loved them all. You know, the Wax Trax bands and so on. And kind of just spread out from there, got into a lot of different kinds of music, not just electronic, not just industrial, a bunch of different kinds of music. And of course, in years after that, we got the internet. I remember going to college and sitting down in my computer class, and the professor was talking about this thing called electronic mail. It was electronic mail, or email for short. We thought, what the hell is email, you know? And it was all so brand new. I didn't know if you were allowed to curse on email. You know, we thought we'd get in trouble for cursing over emails. We had no idea. But, you know, everything followed after that. Once you're on the internet, you figure out what Usenet is. Usenet was a series of electronic bulletin boards. So kids, this was before the web. We had bulletin boards on the internet, no web interface at all. You had to, you know, connect to, usually you had to connect in some other way. And the one bulletin board that we liked to read a lot was called rec.music.industrial. So recreation.music.industrial. So we didn't have, you know, it was often difficult to connect to this, and the people who had connections usually were getting them through colleges. So this was around the time I was in college, the early 90s. You know, in the mid-90s even, things hadn't changed much. I was living in an apartment and connecting to the internet with a 14.4 modem using an amber screen as a terminal. And I had to connect to, this is so hard to believe that this is what was going on just like 20 some years ago, but I would connect to the internet through a Unix shell account, and I was using Tin to read news groups. Anyway, that's kind of beside the point. Things have changed a lot. But on rec music industrial, there was this like schism between the old school industrial purists and the newer fans who are into this industrial rock stuff, all this poser stuff like Nine Inch Nails and Ministry. Um, so of course this was the beginning of, flame wars and troll culture and kind of stuff on the internet. And Lord knows, I wasted a lot of time, participating in that stuff, like we all did back in that point in time. Um, but even that primitive sort of culture, that internet culture, did improve the fan community, and it really did help create a sense of identity. And I'm a part of this group that's appreciating this sort of art, and the internet stuff happened. I guess it's good to point out years after I got Twitch, maybe like 5 years after I picked up this record, but. Surely this album like sparked a lifelong interest in that sort of music, and talking about this stuff on the internet made it easier to find your people and your niche, and that just fanned the flames for me anyway. We want to talk about equipment that Al used on this record. I'm not entirely sure what he used, but I think at some point he had a Fairlight CMI, and he might have used it on this. So the Fairlight CMI was one of the early digital audio workstations. So now you have a digital audio workstation that you can buy for $100 that runs on your computer. Back then you had to buy a Fairlight CMI for $100,000, and it was a big pile of hardware, and you had to learn how to connect it all up and use it. And in fact, the thing was so expensive, it was about as expensive as a house. And it actually came with a full bottle of champagne that you were supposed to use, I guess, to celebrate the fact that you were rich enough to buy a Fairlight CMI. But I guess Al took the proceeds from his success and bought one. And I know Peter Gabriel had one, and Trevor Horn had one, and famously Factory Records refused to buy one for Martin Hannett, who was their more or less house producer. And instead they went on to build the Hacienda nightclub, which, was legendary in its own way, but in Martin Hannett's perspective, it prevented him from making records that could compete with these other artists. Just imagine what Joy Division would have sounded like if Martin had had a Fairlight CMI. It boggles the mind. I'm pretty sure that Peter Gabriel and Trevor Horn kept their Fairlights under lock and key in climate-controlled studios. For sure, Trevor Horn used his to start the band The Art of Noise, and when J.J. Yenchelik and the other folks in that band were sort of playing around with it. But Al took his Fairlight on tour for years. Like, he wasn't precious about it at all. I'm pretty sure you can see it in like old live Ministry and Revolting Cocks videos. He would just have it on stage, and they would use it to run live loops, and instead of running a backing track, Al basically just took the whole studio on tour, which is insane. Chris Connolly was one of Al's collaborators and did a lot of the vocals on, the kind of the later Revolting Cocks stuff. He wrote about this in his autobiography, which was Concrete, Bulletproof, Invisible, and Fried, My Life as a Revolting Cock. And Chris isn't giving me any kickbacks, but I can heartily recommend that book if you're at all interested in Ministry and industrial music. It's a real eye-opener. In fact, I would probably give his bio its own episode in Stronger Than Reason at some point, because it's fantastic. It's a great read. And the audiobook is even better because Chris just busts out laughing half the time. But I'm pretty sure that Chris in that book he talked about playing the Fairlight on the Mine Tour, which is the most notorious Ministry tour of all. And we'll talk about that one later too. So yeah, we talked about the personnel. Al and Patty Jorgensen, produced by Adrian Sherwood. Adrian at this point was a guy who was, had his On-U sound system, and he was making records with Tackhead, and he had the whole Tackhead group of collaborators like Keith LeBlanc and those folks. And he had a particular sound, and I think Adrian Sherwood is someone that Al admired. He admired the big drum sound that Adrian would get and kind of that dubbed out, very funky kind of sound. If you listen to Tackhead records, you'll see what I'm talking about. The Tackhead records, bear some similarity to what Al was doing here on Twitch. And at this point, Al writes in his autobiography that he basically brought Adrian in and just absorbed everything the guy was doing in the studio and learned all of his tricks. And I think he even later, was trading songs with him. I'm pretty sure one of the songs on the following album came from Adrian Sherwood. It's not even an Al track at all, but we can talk about that later too. The other thing to note here is that this is the first time that Al collaborated with Luke Van Acker, who did some vocals on this record. Of course, Luke would become one of the founding members of Revolting Cocks. And then whenever Al toured this record, he brought on some session musicians, and he pulled them from this band in Seattle called the Blackouts. And I'm not exactly sure how he found these guys because Al was in Chicago, but he was certainly a guy. Al was always someone, and still is, someone who can identify talent to work with. And he had a knack for picking people who, had something to offer. And in this case, he found the Blackouts and these four guys in Seattle and ended up working with three of them in some capacity. So the Blackouts were Eric Werner and Paul Barker, Bill Rieflin, and Roland Barker. And Al would bring in Paul Barker and Bill Rieflin to tour with him on the Twitch tour. So Paul played bass and Bill played drums generally. And Roland was in and out of Ministry for a number of years. He played on and off with them at least up through the Psalm 69 album. I think he played like keyboards and sax. So yeah, this began, the collaboration that Al started with these guys that would lead him through the next 10 years or so. And in fact, he listed Paul Barker as, for many years as the only other member of Ministry. And of course, Al being Al, he's a person who always has to disagree. He seems to like to, be contrary and argue points. So he debates, the extent to which Paul was really a creative force in the band. But I think, most of us who were fans around this time, to most of us, Paul's input was pretty clear, right? And to the point where Ministry didn't really sound like Ministry to us anymore after Paul finally had enough of Al's crap and left the band. So anyway, that was his first collaboration with these guys, touring with Twitch. And also on that tour, he had a crew consisting of Dave Rave Ogilvy, who at the time was more or less the fourth member of Skinny Puppy and their longtime producer, and Frank Nardiello. And I think Rave was working, the mix, like the front of house mix. I don't really know. I think that's true. And I think Frank Nardiello was working lights. And Frank, of course, is Groovy Man from My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult. And he and Al went way back. They were both in another Chicago, more or less, rock band called Special Effect together, where Al was playing guitar and Frank was singing. But of course, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, another great Chicago-based industrial rock band that I will talk about at some point. So this record was the start of a lot of great collaborations. So why do I love this? Personally, for me, this album is like a key that opened a door. It was like a gateway into a much larger world of interesting music that wasn't on MTV or the radio, And at the time, in that pre-internet world, that prehistoric world, it seemed like a secret that was just for me and my friends, That was important, And I like a lot of other kinds of music. I don't just like industrial. And to be clear, there were other key albums that opened other doors for me in other genres. And I do want to talk about those albums too. Another one, for instance, a very important one was Substance by New Order. But I can put this CD on right now. I can put this album on and listen to it. And, I'm transported immediately back to 1987. I'm playing video games on my Apple II, listening to this in my headphones, my big orange headphones, over and over and over. And I remember that feeling of wonder and hearing this for the first time. So, very important record for me. Anyway, if you like this discussion, stay tuned because I'll be looking at other albums, again, mostly 80s and 90s electronic, industrial, and alternative. Stronger Than Reason is going to be on YouTube and pretty much anywhere that can host a podcast, so you should be able to find it wherever you want to find it. I don't think there's going to be a fixed schedule. I mean, I feel like I'll probably just record this whenever I feel like it. I hope to get at least a few episodes each month. And I do have a list of about 40 CDs and things that I'd like to talk about. So plenty to talk about going forward. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. Feel free to leave a comment. What do they say? They say like and subscribe. Yeah, sure, why not? I don't know. We'll see where this goes. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.